The blood-stained key felt ice-cold in Maya's trembling hand as she unlocked room 404 for the first time. The hallway reeked of decay and something metallic that made her stomach churn. Previous tenants had vanished without a trace, their belongings left scattered like warnings. As she pushed open the creaking door, a gust of wind carried the scent of rotting flesh and old blood. The room was frozen in time, with dark crimson stains blooming across the floorboards like poisonous flowers. Maya's predecessor had clearly not left voluntarily. Drag marks led to the closet, ending in a pool of congealed blood that had seeped between the floorboards. Her roommate's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't stay in 404 past midnight." But desperate students couldn't afford to be choosy. As she dragged her suitcase inside, something wet and warm dripped onto her neck from the ceiling. She looked up to see fresh blood oozing through cracks in the plaster, forming words that spelled her name in dripping crimson letters. Maya wiped the bloody message from her neck, her hands shaking violently as crimson liquid smeared across her skin. The desk drawer groaned as she yanked it open, revealing a yellowed note written in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The rules were simple yet terrifying. Rule 1. Never open the closet after 3 a.m. Rule 2. If you hear scratching from inside the walls, press your ear against the door and whisper, "Not yet." Rule 3. Burn any hair you find immediately. Rule 4. The thing in the closet is hungry, never feed it. She laughed nervously, dismissing it as a sick joke from a disturbed former tenant. But that night, as the clock struck 2:59 a.m., violent pounding erupted from inside the closet. The wooden door bulged outward as if something massive pressed against it from within. Dark fluid seeped from beneath the closet door, spreading across the floor like a living thing. Maya watched in horror as the blood-formed fingers that crawled toward her bed. The scratching intensified, and she heard wet, tearing sounds followed by guttural whispering that spoke her name in a voice that gurgled with blood. Sleep became impossible as the closet's violent thrashing continued until dawn. Maya discovered clumps of matted hair beneath her pillow, still warm and dripping with fresh blood. Following Rule 3, she gathered the disgusting strands and held them over her lighter's flame. The hair didn't burn, it screamed. High-pitched wails filled the room as the bloody locks writhed like snakes, wrapping around her wrists with surprising strength. She dropped them, and they scuttled beneath the bed like wounded spiders. Desperate for answers, Maya researched room 404's history on her laptop. What she found made her blood run cold. 7 missing students, all from this room, all vanished on the same date. The university covered it up, painting over bloodstains and reassigning room numbers, but 404 always returned. That evening, she found her reflection in the mirror bleeding from the eyes, tears of crimson streaming down the glass. When she touched the mirror, her reflection's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with ice-cold fingers that left bruising marks shaped like tiny mouths filled with needle-sharp teeth. The third night, Maya broke Rule 1. At 3:07 a.m., driven by madness and sleepless terror, she gripped the closet handle. The metal burned her palm with unnatural cold, and bloody frost formed where her fingers touched. The door resisted, then flew open with such force that it ripped from its hinges, crashing to the floor. Inside wasn't a closet, it was a throat. The space stretched into impossible darkness, lined with pulsing flesh and rows of jagged teeth dripping with black saliva. A tongue, thick and covered in bleeding sores, uncoiled from the depths. It lashed out, wrapping around her ankle with crushing force. Maya screamed as the tongue dragged her toward the maw, her fingernails tearing bloody furrows in the wooden floor. She grabbed a bedpost, but the wood splintered, driving shards into her palms. The tongue pulled her closer, and she could smell the stench of rotting meat and old blood mixed with something sweetly putrid. From the darkness emerged a face, her face but wrong, with eyes replaced by weeping wounds and a mouth stretched too wide, filled with broken teeth and clotted blood. Maya's doppelganger leaned from the closet mouth, its ruined face splitting into a grin that exposed too many teeth. "You fed me by breaking the rules," it gurgled, blood bubbling from its lipless mouth. "Every scream, every drop of fear. It makes me stronger." The tongue tightened around her ankle, bones grinding audibly. Maya kicked wildly, her heel connecting with something soft and wet. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and black blood sprayed across the room, sizzling where it touched the floor. She scrambled backward, leaving a trail of bloody footprints, but the tongue whipped out again, this time wrapping around her throat. It lifted her off the ground, and she clawed at the fleshy appendage, her fingers sinking into rotting meat that felt disturbingly warm. The creature pulled her toward its maw, and she could see down its throat into an endless abyss where shadowy figures clawed at the walls. The missing students, their faces frozen in eternal screams, their bodies half-digested and fused together in a writhing mass of flesh and bone. One of them reached out with a skeletal hand, and she recognized her own features twisted in agony. With desperate strength, Maya grabbed the broken closet door and swung it like a weapon. The wood connected with the tongue, and it severed with a wet crunch, spraying arterial blood that burned like acid where it touched her skin. The creature howled, a sound that cracked the windows and sent glass shards flying like deadly rain. Maya's face was cut by the flying glass, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, but she didn't stop. She grabbed her lighter and the note with the rules, holding the paper to the flame. The rules burned, but instead of turning to ash, they transformed into living flames that writhed and screamed. The fire leaped from the paper to the closet's interior, and the creature's shrieks became deafening. The fleshy walls of the closet blackened and peeled back, revealing the rotting corpses of the missing students fused into the walls, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes weeping black blood. The floorboards erupted with gore as the bodies tried to free themselves, hands bursting through wood, fingers grasping at Maya's ankles. One corpse, wearing her predecessor's clothes, grabbed her leg and whispered with a mouth full of maggots, "You're too late. We're already inside you." Maya looked down in horror as her skin began to split, bloody fissures opening across her arms and chest. From the wounds emerged tiny fingers, then hands, then faces, the missing students clawing their way out of her body, tearing through muscle and bone in showers of gore. She fell to her knees, screaming as her own body unraveled, organs spilling onto the floor mixed with the rotting remains of those who came before. The closet creature, burning and dying, reached out with a charred hand and grabbed her heart, ripping it from her chest in a fountain of blood. But as Maya's vision faded, she realized the terrible truth. The rules weren't meant to keep the creature trapped. They were meant to keep it fed and contained. By breaking them, she had set it free, and now it would hunt beyond room 404. Her last sight was the creature crawling from the closet on broken limbs, its body reforming from the blood and flesh scattered across the floor, wearing her face as it opened the door to find its next victim. The university would claim another missing student, and room 404 would wait, bloody and hungry, for the next desperate soul to break the rules. The smell of iron hit Jake before he even opened the basement door, a thick, coppery scent that coated the back of his throat like dried blood. He was broke, desperate, and the late fees for the laundry service were higher than his weekly food budget. The rumor was simple: leave clothes overnight, and they return stained with mud or gore. Most students believed it was just old pipes rusting, but Jake had seen the red stains on the concrete floor that never washed away. He stood before the heavy steel door, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold handle. The hallway lights flickered above, casting long shadows that looked like reaching fingers. He told himself it was just superstition, a story to scare freshmen, but his instincts screamed at him to run. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He could hear a low humming sound vibrating through the floor, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Pushing the door open, the smell intensified, overwhelming and nauseating. The darkness inside seemed to breathe, exhaling a mist that smelled of rotting meat and old pennies. Jake stepped in, ignoring the warning signs painted in what looked suspiciously like fresh crimson paint on the walls. The basement laundry room was a cavern of shadows, illuminated only by flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. Rows of industrial washing machines lined the walls, their circular glass doors resembling wide, unblinking eyes staring into the void. Jake walked between them, his footsteps echoing on the wet floor, which felt slick under his shoes. He looked down and saw dark puddles reflecting the sickly green light. When he touched the wall for support, his hand came away sticky with a viscous red fluid that smelled of coagulated blood. The machines were cold to the touch, yet they hummed with an internal heat that radiated through the metal. He chose machine number 13, the one furthest from the exit, ignoring the warning tag tied to it with human hair. Opening the drum, he gagged at the odor of stagnant water and decay. Inside, the metal was scratched deeply, as if something sharp had clawed its way out from within. He shoved his dirty jeans and jacket inside, trying to ignore the feeling that the machine was waiting to swallow them whole. The detergent dispenser was filled with a thick, dark liquid that looked too much like plasma to be soap. Jake poured the dark liquid into the tray, watching it swirl with a viscosity that made his stomach churn. When he pressed the start button, the machine didn't whir. It groaned, a mechanical sound that mimicked a human cry of pain. Water rushed into the drum, but it wasn't clear. It was a deep, opaque crimson that splashed against the glass. Jake watched in horror as the clothes tumbled through the bloody water, becoming saturated with the red fluid. Bubbles formed on the glass, popping with wet sounds that echoed in the silent room. He leaned closer, squinting through the grime, and saw something tangled in the fabric. It looked like a finger, pale and bloated, rotating with the spin cycle. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by a swirl of dark foam. The vibration of the machine traveled up his arms, shaking his bones. He tried to stop the cycle, but the buttons were unresponsive, slick with a layer of warm slime. The lock clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. He was trapped in the room with the spinning beast, the smell of copper now so strong he could taste it on his tongue. He decided to leave the clothes, convincing himself he would return in the morning despite the terror gripping his heart. Back in his dorm, sleep was impossible. The walls of his room seemed to thin, allowing the sounds from the basement to bleed through the floorboards. He heard the washing machine churning all night, but underneath the mechanical noise was the sound of wet tearing, like meat being ripped from bone. Screams echoed through the pipes, muffled but distinct, belonging to voices he recognized from his classes. Jake huddled under his blankets, sweating profusely as the temperature in his room dropped below freezing. His breath plumed in the air, carrying the scent of the laundry room's decay. At 3 a.m., a heavy thumping started above his bed, rhythmic and violent, as if something was trying to break through the ceiling. He saw dark stains spreading on his sheets, blooming like black flowers. When he touched them, his fingers came away wet with fresh blood. The key to the laundry room, which he had left on his desk, was now covered in rust that flaked off like dried scabs. He knew something was hunting him, drawn by the scent of his fear. Morning brought no sunlight to the basement, only a gray, sickly haze that clung to the floor like fog. Jake returned to the laundry room, his legs shaking so violently he could barely walk. The door was ajar, leaking a thick red fluid that pooled around his shoes. Inside, the air was humid and hot, smelling of a slaughterhouse. Machine number 13 was vibrating violently, shaking the concrete floor beneath it. Blood seeped from the rubber seal of the door, dripping onto the floor with a steady plip-plip sound. The puddle around the machine had grown overnight, a lake of coagulated gore that reflected his pale face. He approached the machine, slipping in the slick fluid, his hands stained red from grabbing the railing. The glass was fogged with condensation mixed with blood, obscuring the view inside. He could hear something moving within the drum, scratching against the glass from the inside. The handle was burning hot, searing his palm when he touched it. He knew he shouldn't open it, but the cycle had finished, and the silence was worse than the noise. He gripped the handle, preparing to face whatever horror waited inside the metal belly. The door opened with a suction sound, like a wound being unsealed, releasing a cloud of steam that smelled of cooked meat. The clothes inside were pristine, white and clean, but soaking wet with a warm, sticky fluid. Jake reached in to pull them out, his hands sinking into the damp fabric that felt like touching skin. As he lifted his jacket, something heavy fell from the pocket into the pool of blood on the floor. It was a key, but not made of metal. It was carved from bone, yellowed and stained with fresh blood that still oozed from its teeth-like ridges. When he picked it up, it pulsed with a faint warmth, beating like a small heart in his hand. The key was covered in grime that looked like ground-up flesh. He wiped it on his pants, but the blood smeared, staining the fabric instantly. A number was etched into the bone. Room 000. He knew there was no room 000 in the building plans. The machines around him began to spin simultaneously, their glass doors cracking under the pressure. Blood sprayed from the fissures, painting the walls in arterial arcs. Jake realized the laundry wasn't cleaning clothes. It was digesting souls, and he was the next ingredient. Compelled by an invisible force, Jake walked toward the back wall where no door existed on the blueprints. The concrete shimmered and melted away, revealing a doorway made of stretched human skin, pulsating with veins. The bone key fit into the lock, which was a gaping mouth embedded in the flesh wall. Turning it caused the door to scream, a high-pitched wail that shattered the remaining light bulbs. The door swung open to reveal a corridor lined with hanging bodies, their chests open and empty, dripping blood onto the floor. Jake tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, glued by the blood pooling around his shoes. The washing machines behind him exploded, sending shards of glass and gore flying through the air. A tentacle of wet flesh shot out from the doorway, wrapping around Jake's throat. It dragged him toward the fleshy corridor, his nails scraping useless lines into the floor. He screamed as his skin began to merge with the walls, his body stretching and tearing. The last thing he saw was his own jacket hanging on a hook inside the room, still dripping wet. The laundry room fell silent, waiting for the next broke student to ignore the rumors and feed the machine. The silence of the dorm during finals was broken not by screams, but by the sudden death of every screen, plunging hundreds of stressed students into digital isolation within seconds, until a new network blinked into existence on every device simultaneously, pulsing with a signal strength that felt too strong, too close to be real or safe. It was unsecured, named Help Unnecessary, and Alex stared at the glowing text, a chill crawling up his spine as the letters seemed to bleed slightly on the LCD screen, leaving red smudges on his fingers that wouldn't wipe away. The dormitory hallway outside was unnaturally quiet. No footsteps, no chatter, only the hum of electricity growing louder and smelling of ozone and copper, like a storm mixed with a slaughterhouse. He tapped the name, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain, ignoring the warning pop-up that flashed in red text, "Connection will drain life." His phone felt heavy in his hand, vibrating with a rhythm that matched his own accelerating heartbeat, threatening to burst from the internal pressure. He knew he should turn it off, but the glow of the network name hypnotized him, promising answers to the disappearances everyone whispered about in the dark. He pressed connect, and the screen flashed blood red before settling into darkness, sealing his fate forever. Instead of a browser window, an audio interface opened automatically, displaying waveforms that moved like living worms across the black glass, writhing in pain. No internet data loaded, only sound, crisp and terrifyingly close, as if the microphone was inserted directly inside his ear canal. At first, it sounded like typical dorm noise. Pages turning, pencils scratching, the low murmur of studying neighbors, but the tones were wrong, distorted by a layer of static that sounded like wet breathing. Alex turned the volume down, but the sound grew louder, bypassing the hardware controls to vibrate directly against his eardrum until it bled. He heard a chair scrape across the floor above him, followed by a heavy thud that shook his bed frame and cracked the plaster. The waveform spiked violently, turning from green to a deep, pulsing crimson that stained the glass. He recognized the voice on the feed. It was his roommate, who had vanished 3 days ago, sounding confused and terrified. The audio whispered, "Can you hear me?" followed by the sound of something dragging across the ceiling, leaving a trail of dark, viscous fluid that smelled of rusted iron and began to drip onto Alex's face. The audio feed shifted abruptly from whispers to agonizing screams that tore through the silence of the room, shattering the window glass inward. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of students, overlapping in a symphony of pain that made Alex's nose bleed instantly, coating his lips in copper. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, the drywall vibrating visibly with the force of the digital anguish, cracking open to reveal muscle beneath the paint. He tried to drop the phone, but it was searing hot, burning his palm with the intensity of a branding iron that fused skin to plastic. The screen displayed a live map of the dormitory, but the rooms were labeled with dates of death instead of numbers, glowing in red. Red dots pulsed where students had vanished, each one emitting a low-frequency hum that made Alex's teeth ache and gums bleed. He heard the sound of bones breaking on the feed, crisp and wet, synchronized with the cracks spreading across his own bedroom wall. Blood began to seep from the electrical outlets, dripping onto the carpet in thick, coagulated pools that bubbled. The network wasn't just broadcasting. It was harvesting, pulling the life force from the living to sustain the dead trapped within the signal, filling his mouth with blood. Desperate to escape, Alex scrambled for the door, but the handle was fused to the frame with a substance that looked like melted flesh and hardened blood. His phone screen cracked further, spiderweb fractures leaking actual blood that stained his fingers and shirt, soaking through to his skin. The voices on the network became clearer, identifying him by name, reciting his student ID number in a monotone drone that echoed in his skull. Alex, room 302. Next. The walls began to breathe, expanding and contracting like giant lungs, pushing him toward the center of the room where the blood pooled deepest. He looked at the floor and saw shadows detaching themselves from the furniture, reaching for his ankles with cold, solid hands that left bruising marks. The Wi-Fi signal bars on his phone filled up completely, turning black, and a new message appeared, upload complete. He felt a sharp pain in his wrist where the phone touched him, looking down to see skin merging with plastic, veins turning into circuitry that sparked. The blood on the floor started to boil, releasing steam that carried the faces of the missing students screaming in silence, their mouths wide open in agony. Alex stumbled back against the bed, knocking over a lamp that shattered, scattering glass that turned into shards of bone upon impact, cutting his feet deeply. He grabbed his laptop, hoping to find a way to disconnect the network from the main router, but the screen showed only a list of usernames written in blood. Every name belonged to a student who had disappeared over the last decade, their status marked as processing next to a photo of their corpse. The cursor moved on its own, highlighting Alex's name and dragging it into a folder labeled Archived Screams. Locking the file permanently, he typed furiously, trying to delete the network, but the keys stuck, oozing a dark slime that smelled of decay and burned his fingertips. The audio feed switched to a live view of his own room, showing him standing there from the corner perspective, but in the video he was already dead. His digital corpse lay on the floor, throat slit, while his living body watched in horror, unable to look away. The discrepancy broke his mind, causing blood to pour from his eyes and ears, pooling on the keyboard. The laptop fan spun wildly, sounding like a jet engine, sucking the air out of the room until he gasped for breath, drowning in blood. The lights in the room died completely, leaving only the glow of the devices which now emitted a sickly purple radiation that burned his skin. Alex's shadow stretched across the floor, independent of his movement, walking toward the wall where the blood was pooling deepest, dragging his physical body with it. He tried to scream, but his voice was captured by the microphone, added to the loop of suffering playing on every connected device in the dormitory building. Other students were waking up now, their phones glowing in the dark, connecting to the same trap unknowingly. He heard their screams through his phone, a network of dying voices linking together in a digital web of agony that tightened around his throat. The wall in front of him dissolved into static, revealing a void filled with floating cables that looked like intestines, dripping gore. They whipped out, wrapping around his chest and limbs, tightening until ribs cracked audibly. The blood on his skin began to glow, forming the Wi-Fi symbol on his forehead before burning itself into the flesh, branding him. He understood now that the signal never crashed. It was waiting for enough victims to connect simultaneously to open the gateway, feeding on their pain. In the final moment, Alex was pulled into the wall, his body stretching and distorting like glitching video footage, tearing apart at the seams. His scream was the last thing recorded, added to the Help Understorm network as a new track for future students to hear when they connected. The room returned to silence, pristine and clean, as if no violence had ever occurred, the blood vanishing into the pores of the concrete. The cracks sealed, and the phone lay on the floor, screen dark and cold, covered in a thin layer of dust. Outside, the sun rose over the university, and new students walked toward the dormitory, unaware of the signal waiting in the walls to claim them. The Wi-Fi list refreshed on their phones, the network name blinking invitingly in the quiet morning air, promising connection. Somewhere inside the concrete, Alex's voice joined the chorus, whispering to the next victim who would connect out of desperation for internet access. The cycle continued, the dormitory feeding on the stress and fear of finals week to power its haunted infrastructure, growing stronger. The network remained unsecured, open to anyone foolish enough to seek connection in the silence, waiting for the next drop. The walls hummed softly, hungry for the next upload, waiting for the next signal to drop so the harvest could begin again, bloody and endless. The silence in room 302 was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against Sarah's eardrums like deep water. From the moment she moved in, the air felt thick with an unseen presence, a suffocating weight that made the hair on her arms stand up constantly. Her assigned roommate never arrived. No name on the door, no bed made on the other side, yet Sarah never felt alone. Every time she turned her back, the temperature in the room would plummet, breath visible in the sudden cold fog. She would hear the faint creak of floorboards behind her, rhythmic and deliberate, stopping only when she spun around to face the emptiness. The shadows in the corner seemed to stretch longer than physics allowed, pooling into a darkness that swallowed the light from her desk lamp. One night, waking from a nightmare, she saw the doorknob turning slowly, inch by inch, though the lock was engaged. A low, wet breathing sound filled the room, coming from right beside her ear, hot and smelling of damp earth. She screamed into the pillow, but the breathing continued, steady and mocking, proving that someone or something was sharing her space, watching her every twitch with invisible eyes. The thefts began subtly, almost politely, which made them infinitely more terrifying. Sarah would buy a carton of milk, label it clearly with her name in bold red marker, and place it on the top shelf of the shared fridge. By morning, the carton would be gone, not spilled or knocked over, but vanished entirely, leaving no trace except for a single, sticky drop of white liquid on the shelf below. Then came the bread, the cheese, and eventually entire meals she had prepared late at night. It wasn't just food. Personal items started migrating across the room. Her favorite pen would appear on the stranger's desk, covered in a strange, oily residue that smelled of rotting flowers. Her toothbrush, kept in a closed cup, would be found damp and warm, the bristles worn down as if used vigorously by someone with jagged teeth. One morning, she found her pajamas folded neatly on her chair, though she swore she had left them thrown on the floor. When she picked them up, they were soaking wet and freezing cold, dripping water that stained her hands with a murky, gray sludge. The realization settled in her gut like a stone. Someone was living here, eating her food, using her things, and touching her while she slept. The bathroom became a chamber of horrors where Sarah's sanity began to fracture under the weight of undeniable evidence. She would lock the door tightly before showering, securing the chain and the bolt, yet upon exiting, she would find the mirror fogged up with condensation in the shape of a handprint far too large to be hers. The shower curtain, which she always pulled closed, would be pushed aside, dripping wet, with muddy footprints leading from the drain to the toilet. One terrifying morning, she discovered her towel missing from the rack. Searching frantically, she found it balled up in the corner of the shower stall, soaked in something dark and viscous that wasn't water. When she unfolded it, a long, dark hair, thick and coarse, unlike her own fine strands, was tangled tightly around the fabric. The smell in the bathroom intensified, a cloying scent of mildew and old sweat that clung to the back of her throat. She scrubbed the tiles until her knuckles bled, trying to remove the grime, but the stains seemed to bleed through the grout, reappearing moments after she wiped them away. That night, she heard the toilet flush in the middle of the night, followed by the sound of someone gargling water, a grotesque, choking noise that echoed through the thin walls. Academic life turned into a surreal nightmare when Sarah began finding assignments on her desk that she had never written. At first, they looked like her handwriting, perfect copies of her style, but the content was disturbing. Essays about death, drawings of flayed bodies, and mathematical equations that solved for variables representing human suffering appeared overnight. The papers were warm to the touch, as if they had just been pulled from a living body, and they smelled of copper and dried blood. One morning, she found a thesis paper titled "The Art of Watching" signed with her name, but the text described in graphic detail the act of observing someone sleep, noting the exact time she breathed hardest and when she twitched. The final page contained a sketch of her own bed, drawn from the perspective of the corner of the room where nothing stood. Panic seized her chest as she realized the intruder wasn't just living there. It was studying her, mimicking her, and perhaps planning to replace her. She tore the papers apart, scattering them across the floor, but by evening, they had reassembled themselves on her desk, taped together with strips of skin-colored material that felt disturbingly like human epidermis. Sleep became a battlefield where Sarah fought to keep her eyes open, terrified of what happened when her consciousness faded. She tried caffeine pills, loud music, and bright lights, but exhaustion eventually dragged her under. When she woke, the room was always different, rearranged in subtle ways that signaled a violation of her sanctuary. Her books would be stacked in towers that defied gravity, balanced precariously on the edge of the desk. Her clothes would be laid out on the floor in the shape of a human body, complete with a head and limbs formed from her sweaters and jeans. One morning, she woke to find her own hair cut short, scattered across her pillow in neat piles, though she remembered going to bed with long locks. A pair of scissors lay on her nightstand, the blades crusted with dried blood and small fragments of flesh. The worst part was the feeling of being watched even when awake. The air pressure would change, creating a vacuum effect that pulled her toward the empty corner. She could feel a gaze burning into the back of her neck, intense and hateful, making her skin crawl as if insects were marching beneath it. She knew she couldn't stay another night without proof, without seeing the monster that shared her breath. Determined to catch the entity, Sarah spent her entire savings on high-end surveillance equipment, setting up 4 cameras with night vision covering every angle of the room. She positioned one directly facing the ominous corner, another on the door, one above the bed, and the last hidden inside a stuffed animal on the shelf. She armed herself with a kitchen knife, taping it to her wrist so she couldn't drop it if paralyzed by fear. As night fell, she sat in the center of the room, staring at the corner, waiting for the shadows to coalesce into a form. Hours ticked by, the silence growing heavier, until her eyelids finally drooped. She fought sleep, pinching her arms, splashing water on her face, but eventually, darkness took her. When she jolted awake hours later, the room was freezing, and the camera's red recording lights were blinking steadily. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she grabbed the laptop to review the footage. She expected to see a person sneaking in, a prankster, or perhaps a hallucination. Instead, the timestamp showed that the room had been occupied the entire time, even when she was sitting right there, wide awake. The terror began before she even pressed play. Sarah's fingers trembled violently as she clicked on the first video file, the screen glowing with the eerie green hue of night vision. The footage from the door camera showed nothing entering or leaving. The room remained sealed, but the camera focused on the corner revealed the horror. At 10 p.m., while Sarah was reading in bed, the empty space in the corner began to distort. The air shimmered like heat haze, and slowly, a figure materialized. It wasn't transparent. It was solid, standing perfectly still, facing the wall. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to have too many joints. It wore tattered clothes that looked like they belonged to a decade ago, stained with dark patches. Sarah watched in paralyzed horror as the figure on the screen turned its head slowly toward the camera, revealing a face that was smooth and featureless, save for a vertical slit where a mouth should be. It didn't move while she was awake. It only existed in the periphery of her vision. The timestamp advanced, and the figure took a step closer to her bed, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a stop-motion animation brought to life by a madman. As the video progressed, the horror escalated beyond comprehension. The figure in the corner began to move only when Sarah's eyes closed in the footage. Every time she drifted off to sleep in the video, the creature lunged forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. It would hover over her sleeping form, its featureless face inches from hers, the vertical slit on its face pulsing open to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. It didn't attack. It inspected. Long, spindly fingers traced the contour of her jaw, her neck, her chest, mapping her anatomy with clinical precision. At one point, the creature leaned down and appeared to inhale deeply, drawing something visible, a wispy gray vapor, from Sarah's mouth into its own. This happened repeatedly throughout the night. Each time Sarah slept, the creature fed on her essence. The most terrifying moment came at 3:33 a.m., when the creature stood up and walked directly into the camera lens, filling the screen with its distorted face. It raised a hand and pointed directly at the real Sarah, who was watching the playback, acknowledging her presence in the present moment. It knew she was watching. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The creature hadn't just been in the room yesterday. It had been there since the day she moved in. She frantically scrolled through the archived footage from previous nights, and the pattern was consistent. Every night, the same ritual. The creature emerging from the corner, feeding on her while she slept, returning to its spot before dawn. But tonight was different. In the live feed currently recording, the corner was empty. Sarah whipped her head around to look at the actual corner of her room. It was vacant. Relief washed over her for a split second before pure dread froze her blood. If it wasn't in the corner, where was it? The camera on her desk flickered, and the image distorted. On the screen, she saw the creature standing right behind her chair, its hand resting on her shoulder. She felt the weight of that hand instantly, heavy and cold, pressing down on her real shoulder. She tried to scream, but her vocal cords locked, paralyzed by an unseen force. The vertical slit on the creature's face, visible now in the reflection of her dark computer monitor, widened into a grin. The room plunged into absolute darkness as the power died, leaving only the faint glow of the laptop screen. Sarah felt the creature's breath on her neck, hot and rancid, smelling of the grave. It whispered then, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "You saw me, so now I can take you." The grip on her shoulder tightened, bones grinding under the pressure. She was dragged backward out of her chair, her feet sliding helplessly across the floor. She clawed at the carpet, nails breaking, leaving trails of blood, but the strength pulling her was supernatural. The laptop screen showed the camera's view of the room one last time, her body being dragged toward the corner, where the air shimmered and twisted into a portal of swirling black void. As she crossed the threshold of the corner, she saw flashes of other students, faces twisted in eternal screams, trapped in the walls of the dimension beyond. The last thing she saw was her own room from the outside, the door swinging shut on its own. The next morning, the room was pristine, silent, and empty. A new student would arrive soon, unaware that the double room was now single again, waiting for the invisible roommate to begin the cycle anew, hungry and patient in the shadows. Some locks exist not to protect the world from thieves, but to protect the world from what lies behind them. 5 teenagers stood beneath the crumbling archway of the Blackwood mansion, the heavy rain soaking through their jackets as lightning illuminated the rotting facade. They had come seeking thrills, documenting their exploration for social media fame. but the air here tasted metallic, like old pennies and dried blood. Jake, the leader, pushed open the main entrance, the wood groaning under the pressure of decades of neglect. Inside, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the beam of their flashlights whole. A sense of impending doom hung heavy in the stagnant air, pressing against their chests like a physical weight. They laughed nervously, trying to drown out the silence, but their voices sounded flat and dead against the peeling wallpaper. They didn't know that the house was hungry, waiting for fresh souls to warm its cold halls. The hook was set the moment they crossed the threshold, baited by curiosity and sealed by their own arrogance. They were not explorers. They were offerings walking willingly into a slaughterhouse disguised as a home. They moved deeper into the mansion, their boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine yet decayed floorboards. At the end of the second-floor hallway, a single door stood out, wrapped heavily in rusted iron chains. The metal was thick, woven together in a complex pattern that seemed almost ritualistic rather than practical. Sarah pointed out the warning symbols carved into the wood beneath the chains, ancient sigils meant to bind and restrain. Most of the group wanted to leave immediately, feeling a primal instinct screaming that this door should never be opened. However, Jake's ego outweighed his fear, and he pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his backpack. He argued that the chains were just a prank by previous visitors, a story to scare away trespassers. The air around the door was significantly colder, their breath visible in the flashlight's beams. As Jake positioned the cutters around the main lock, a low hum vibrated through the floor, shaking the dust from the ceiling. They ignored the warning signs of the earth itself trembling beneath their feet. The decision was made, the metal was about to snap, and the seal was about to break. With a tremendous effort, Jake squeezed the handles of the bolt cutters, the metal screaming in protest before finally snapping with a deafening clang. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, startling the birds nesting in the attic above. As the chains fell to the floor with a heavy thud, a gust of wind blew from behind the door, though there were no windows in the room. The smell hit them instantly, a pungent mixture of rotting flesh and copper that made them gag. Mike covered his mouth, stumbling back, but Jake pushed the door open regardless. The hinges shrieked, a sound like a dying animal, as the wood scraped against the frame. Inside, the darkness was denser than the hallway, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. They stepped over the fallen chains, crossing the threshold without realizing they had just signed their death warrants. The floor inside was sticky, though they couldn't see what caused the residue in the dim light. Every instinct told them to run, but their feet felt heavy, as if the gravity in the room had increased tenfold. They were trapped the moment the lock broke. Shining their flashlights into the small room, they expected to find treasures or hidden passages, but the sight was far more disturbing. In the center of the empty space sat a single wooden chair, facing directly into the corner of the room. The walls around the chair were covered in deep scratch marks, gouged into the plaster as if someone had tried to claw their way out for years. There were no windows, no other doors, just four walls and that solitary chair waiting for an occupant. The bloodstains on the floor were fresh, glistening wetly under the beam of the light, contrasting with the decades of dust elsewhere. Sarah whispered that someone must have been held here, imprisoned against their will for a terrible purpose. The air was thick with the sound of buzzing flies, though no insects were visible to the naked eye. The chair looked inviting yet menacing, as if it expected someone to sit down immediately. Jake laughed it off, calling it a creepy prank, but his voice trembled with underlying fear. The room felt alive, watching them with invisible eyes from the corners where the shadows pooled deepest. Something was missing from the chair, something that had just been released. As they stepped closer to inspect the scratches, they realized the marks were not made by fingernails but by something sharper, like claws or knives. Deep grooves ran down the wall, stained with dark, dried blood that had seeped into the plaster over time. Mike knelt down to touch the floor, pulling his hand back quickly when he realized the sticky substance was warm blood. It wasn't old. It was fresh, pumping from a wound that hadn't happened yet or was happening now. The realization drained the color from their faces, turning them pale as sheets in the flickering light. Sarah began to hyperventilate, backing away toward the door, but the doorway seemed to have shrunk slightly. The chains on the floor began to rattle without any wind touching them, sliding across the wood as if pulled by an invisible hand. They understood now that the chains were not there to keep intruders out of the room. They were there to keep the occupant of the chair inside the room. The horror of their mistake settled in their stomachs like a heavy stone. They had freed a predator that had been starving in the dark for far too long. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, freezing the sweat on their brows as their breath plumed in the air like smoke. A voice whispered from the darkness behind them, not from the room, but from the hallway they had just entered. It was a wet, gurgling sound, like words spoken through a throat filled with blood. "You let me out," the voice rasped, vibrating in their bones rather than their ears. They spun around simultaneously, shining their lights into the corridor, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch toward them, elongating unnaturally against the walls. Jake shouted for everyone to run, but his voice was swallowed by the sudden silence that fell over the house. The door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the frame, locking them inside the small room with whatever was now free. The flashlights flickered and died one by one, leaving them in total darkness. Panic erupted as they bumped into each other, screaming in the void. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the thing standing among them, invisible but undeniably present. In the darkness, a scream tore through the air as something sharp slashed across Mike's throat. The sound of spraying blood was audible, wet and heavy against the silence of the room. Mike gurgled, clutching his neck as warm life fluid pumped through his fingers onto the floor. He fell to his knees, choking on his own blood, while the others scrambled away in terror. Another flash of light revealed a shadowy figure standing over Mike, its form shifting and indistinct like smoke given shape. It lunged at Sarah, dragging her into the corner where the chair sat. Her screams were cut short by the sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone. The smell of iron became overwhelming, coating the back of their throats with the taste of violence. Jake swung his flashlight like a club, hitting nothing but air, while the sounds of mutilation continued in the corner. They were not fighting a human. They were fighting a manifestation of pure rage and hunger. The room was becoming a slaughterhouse, the walls splattered with fresh red paint made from their friends. The entity moved faster than the eye could follow, appearing behind Jake before he could turn around. Claws raked down his back, tearing through his jacket and skin alike, exposing muscle and bone. He collapsed forward, screaming in agony as the pain blinded him. The last surviving teen, Emily, huddled against the wall, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows. She watched in horror as Jake was dragged across the floor, leaving a thick trail of blood behind him. The thing was playing with them, savoring the fear before the final kill. The chair in the corner was now stained completely red, soaked in the blood of the victims. Emily tried to pray, but the words died in her throat as the entity turned its attention toward her. It didn't walk. It glided, the sound of wet footsteps slapping against the floorboards. The darkness seemed to converge on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She realized there was no escape, no weapon, and no mercy waiting for her in this room. Emily scrambled toward the door, clawing at the wood where the lock had been, but it was sealed shut from the outside. Her fingernails broke and bled as she, desperate, tried to pry the door open. Behind her, the sounds of chewing and crunching stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate approach. She could feel the cold breath on the back of her neck, smelling of grave soil and rot. She turned around to face her death, holding up her hands in a futile gesture of defense. The entity loomed over her, its face a void of endless blackness with two burning red eyes. It raised a hand covered in the blood of her friends, dripping onto the floor with a rhythmic plip-plip sound. Emily screamed as the hand descended, not to strike her, but to touch her forehead. A burning sensation spread through her body, paralyzing her muscles instantly. She fell to the floor, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped within her own conscious mind. The violence was over for her, but the horror was just beginning. The entity lifted Emily's limp body and placed her gently onto the wooden chair in the corner. It faced her toward the wall, just like the previous occupant had been forced to sit. From outside the room, the sound of heavy chains being dragged across the floor echoed loudly. The entity was relocking the door, securing the chains around the outside handle once more. Emily sat in the darkness, alive but paralyzed, waiting for the next group of foolish teenagers to arrive. She could hear their voices in the distance, drawing closer to the mansion, drawn by the legend of the locked room. She wanted to scream a warning, to tell them to run, but her voice was stolen. The chains clicked into place, sealing her fate as the new guardian of the room. The lock on the outside was not for protection. It was a cage for the next victim. The cycle of blood and fear would continue forever, fed by curiosity and sealed by chains. The house was full again, and the hunger was temporarily satisfied. Some houses do not welcome guests. They harvest them. Arthur Blackwood stumbled through the blinding snow, the wind screaming like 1,000 damned souls tearing at his coat. He had been hiking alone when the storm hit, and now, lost and freezing, he spotted a faint glow through the trees. A small cottage stood ahead, its windows flickering with warm, inviting light. It seemed impossible, a house lit and warm in the middle of an abandoned forest during a deadly blizzard. But desperation outweighed caution, and Arthur pushed forward, his numb fingers clawing at the wooden door. It opened easily, too easily, as if it had been expecting him. The moment he stepped inside, the storm's roar vanished, replaced by a comforting crackle of fire and the rich aroma of herbs and meat. He should have run. He should have noticed the silence was too perfect, the warmth too intentional. But his frozen body betrayed him, craving the heat like a dying man craves water. He closed the door behind him, sealing his fate with a soft click. The hook was baited with comfort, and Arthur had swallowed it whole. The interior of the cottage was immaculate, defying the decay that should have consumed it after decades of neglect. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. The air was thick with the scent of rosemary, thyme, and something metallic underneath, like copper coins or old blood. Arthur removed his wet coat, his trembling hands reaching toward the flames. On the wooden table in the center of the room, a bowl of steaming soup sat waiting, accompanied by fresh bread and a polished silver spoon. The steam rose in perfect spirals, as if the meal had been prepared seconds ago. He approached cautiously, his stomach growling despite his unease. The soup was a deep crimson color, rich and glossy, with herbs floating on the surface. He leaned closer to inspect it, and for a moment, he thought he saw something dark and solid submerged at the bottom. He pulled back, shaking his head, blaming his exhaustion for the hallucination. But the smell was intoxicating, pulling him toward the bowl like a magnet. He didn't notice the faint scratches on the floorboards, leading from the table toward the stairs. Arthur's hunger overpowered his caution, and he lifted the silver spoon to his lips. The soup was incredibly hot, burning his tongue, but the flavor was exquisite, rich, savory, and strangely familiar. As he swallowed, a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt like liquid comfort, like a drug easing his fear. He took another spoonful, then another, losing himself in the taste. But with each bite, the metallic undertone grew stronger, coating his throat with the taste of iron. He paused, looking down at the bowl, and this time he saw it clearly. A small, pale fragment floating among the herbs. It looked like a piece of fingernail or perhaps a sliver of bone. His stomach churned violently, and he dropped the spoon, which clattered loudly against the ceramic. The sound echoed through the cottage, followed immediately by a new noise. From upstairs, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps walking across the floorboards above his head. Someone was up there. Someone who had cooked this meal. The creaking of the stairs grew louder, each step a deliberate announcement of approach. Arthur backed away from the table, his eyes fixed on the dark archway leading to the staircase. A shadow appeared first, elongated and distorted against the wall. Then a figure emerged, but it was not human. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was pale and translucent, revealing dark veins pulsing beneath. It wore a chef's apron, stained with layers of old and fresh blood that had hardened into a crust. In its hand, it held a long, serrated knife that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. The creature's face was a mask of stitched flesh, with button eyes that reflected the flames like black mirrors. It tilted its head, studying Arthur with curiosity, as a cook might study a new ingredient. Arthur tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The creature took another step forward, and the smell of raw meat and formaldehyde filled the room. It spoke, its voice a wet rasp that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "Welcome to dinner," the creature rasped, its stitched mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. Arthur turned to run, but his legs refused to obey, rooted to the floor by primal terror. The creature moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance in a blur. The serrated knife flashed, and a searing pain erupted across Arthur's forearm. He looked down to see a deep, jagged gash opening, blood welling up in thick, dark pulses. The creature caught the blood in a small silver bowl, holding it under the wound like a chef collecting stock. Arthur screamed finally, the sound raw and desperate. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it wildly. The weapon connected with the creature's shoulder with a sickening crunch, but instead of crying out, the entity simply tilted its head, as if intrigued by the resistance. Black fluid oozed from the wound, smelling of rot and sulfur. The creature dropped the bowl of Arthur's blood and lunged again, its long fingers clawing at his face. Arthur felt hot tears mix with blood as nails raked across his cheek, tearing flesh from bone. Arthur stumbled backward, crashing into the table and sending the bowl of soup flying. The crimson liquid splashed across the floor, and among the herbs and broth, small, recognizable pieces tumbled out. A human molar, a segment of finger bone, a lock of hair. The soup was not made from animals. The realization hit him with more force than any blow. This chef had been harvesting previous victims, cooking them into meals for the next unsuspecting traveler. Arthur was not a guest, he was the next ingredient. The creature advanced, its button eyes gleaming with hunger. Arthur grabbed the iron poker again, but his grip was slippery with his own blood. He swung desperately, but the creature caught his wrist with a hand cold as grave soil. The strength was inhuman, crushing bones with a sound like snapping twigs. Arthur felt his radius fracture, the pain white-hot and blinding. The creature leaned close, its stitched mouth near his ear, and whispered, "You taste of fear. It enhances the flavor." The creature dragged Arthur toward the fireplace, his broken arm trailing uselessly behind him. He kicked and thrashed, but the entity's grip was unbreakable. The heat from the flames was intense, singing his clothes and blistering his skin. The creature forced him down onto a large wooden butcher's block that Arthur hadn't noticed before, stained dark with years of use. Heavy iron rings hung from the ceiling above it. With terrifying efficiency, the entity produced lengths of chain and began securing Arthur's limbs to the block. He screamed until his voice gave out, his pleas swallowed by the crackling fire. The creature picked up the serrated knife again, testing its edge with a long, slender finger. It began to hum a tuneless, ancient melody as it worked. The first cut was precise, a long incision along Arthur's abdomen that peeled back skin and fat to reveal the muscle beneath. Arthur's vision swam with pain, but he was forced to watch as the creature carefully removed a section of tissue, placing it into a clean ceramic dish. As the creature worked, Arthur's consciousness began to fade, the pain becoming a distant roar. Through the haze, he saw the entity move to the fireplace, where a new pot bubbled over the flames. It added the freshly harvested tissue to the simmering broth, along with herbs from the table. The aroma that filled the room was now unmistakably that of cooking meat, rich and inviting, but Arthur knew its source. The creature stirred the pot, then tasted the broth from a wooden spoon. It nodded in approval, its button eyes reflecting the firelight. It returned to Arthur, who was barely clinging to life, and whispered, "The meal is almost ready. You will be part of something eternal." The creature then produced a needle and thread, and with grotesque care, began to stitch Arthur's wounds closed, not to heal him, but to preserve the meat. Each pull of the thread sent fresh waves of agony through him. He realized with final, horrifying clarity that he was being prepared not for death, but for consumption. His body would become the soup, his bones the stock, for the next lost soul who sought shelter. In his final moments, Arthur's eyes focused on the bowl of soup he had eaten earlier, still spilled on the floor. He understood now that every traveler who had ever sought warmth in this cottage had ended the same way, as ingredients in the endless meal. The creature finished its preparations and lifted Arthur's prepared body toward the pot. As he was lowered into the boiling broth, the pain was eclipsed by a profound, existential horror. He was becoming the very thing he had consumed. The last thing he saw was the creature's stitched smile, reflected in the bubbling surface of the pot. Then, darkness. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cottage, all was warm and quiet. The fire crackled contentedly. On the table, a fresh bowl of steaming crimson soup waited, accompanied by bread and a polished spoon. Upstairs, footsteps began to pace again, waiting for the next knock at the door. The lock clicked softly, the house breathed, and the cycle of hunger continued. The warm house was always hungry, and it always saved a seat for dinner. They say that mirrors are not merely glass and silver, but rather fragile doors separating our world from something much darker and older. Elias Thorne knew this folklore well, yet his curiosity as a professional urban explorer always outweighed his deep-seated superstition. He stood before the rusted gates of Blackwood Manor, a Victorian masterpiece left to rot amidst the overgrown woods for decades. The house had a terrifying reputation for swallowing visitors whole, but Elias only cared about capturing the perfect shot for his portfolio. The sky was bruising purple with an incoming storm, adding a dramatic, ominous backdrop to the decay surrounding him. He adjusted his camera strap, feeling the familiar weight of the equipment against his chest. There was a silence here that felt heavy, almost pressurized, as if the air itself was holding its breath waiting for him. He stepped over the broken fence, his boots crunching loudly on dry leaves. He told himself he was just an observer, a ghost hunting for images rather than spirits. But as he pushed open the front door, the hinges screaming in protest, he felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. He was no longer just an observer. He was an intruder in a place that remembered every footstep. The hook was set, the trap was waiting, and Elias had just walked willingly into the frame. The interior of the manor was a tomb of forgotten memories, filled with the pungent scent of damp wood and old, decaying paper. Elias turned on his powerful flashlight, the bright beam cutting through the thick dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Every step he took on the wooden floorboards elicited a loud groan, as if the house was physically complaining about his unwelcome presence. He moved through the grand foyer, where a crystal chandelier lay shattered on the ground like broken ice reflecting his light. He wasn't looking for valuables or gold. He was hunting for atmosphere, for the kind of decay that told a tragic story without using any words. His camera clicked softly as he captured the peeling wallpaper and the shadows stretching long across the hallway. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched from the surrounding darkness. He spun around quickly, shining his light into the corners, but there was nothing there except shifting shadows playing tricks on his mind. He laughed nervously to himself, trying to break the tension that was tightening around his throat. It was just an old house, he reminded himself, nothing more than rotting timber and rusted nails. Yet, the silence seemed to absorb his laughter, leaving him in a void that felt incredibly lonely. He continued deeper into the house, drawn by an invisible thread pulling him toward the upper floor. The staircase was precarious, the wood worn smooth by generations of feet that no longer walked this earth. Elias climbed slowly, testing each step before committing his full weight to the dangerous ascent. The air grew significantly colder as he rose, the temperature dropping noticeably with every step he took toward the second floor. At the top of the landing, a long corridor stretched out, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movement across the hall. He ignored the paintings, focusing instead on the door at the very end of the hallway, which was left slightly ajar. A strange light seemed to emanate from within that room, though there was no electricity in the house to power any bulbs. He pushed the door open, revealing a master bedroom frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the sheets gray with age, but the focal point of the room was unmistakable. Standing against the far wall was a massive mirror, framed in ornate gold that somehow remained untarnished by the years of neglect. It stood out violently against the decay, pristine and inviting. Elias felt a magnetic pull toward it, his legs moving almost without his conscious command. He raised his camera, framing the shot, but something about the glass surface made him hesitate. It looked less like a reflection and more like a deep, still pool of water waiting to swallow him whole. The dust around the room avoided the mirror, as if protected by an invisible barrier. He set up his tripod in front of the mirror, the legs sinking slightly into the dusty carpet beneath them. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a clock that he couldn't locate anywhere in the vicinity. Elias adjusted the lens, focusing sharply on his own image standing within the glass. He looked tired, his face pale under the dim light of his camera's display screen. He decided to break the tension with a bit of humor, something he often did to calm his nerves during solo explorations. He raised his hand and waved at his reflection, a silly, casual gesture meant to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. He smiled at himself, expecting the familiar mimicry of a normal mirror. But for a split second, he thought he saw the reflection blink before he did. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light or fatigue playing games with his vision. He took the photo, the flash illuminating the room in a brief, blinding white burst. When the light faded, the room felt heavier, the air thicker than before. He packed his gear quickly, the urge to leave becoming overwhelming. He didn't look at the mirror again as he turned his back, feeling the gaze of the glass burning into his spine. The silence returned, but now it felt expectant, like a predator waiting for its prey to turn around. Elias practically ran down the stairs, his boots slipping on the polished wood in his haste to escape the manor. The front door seemed further away than before, the hallway stretching out like a tunnel that refused to end. He burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as the storm began to break overhead. Rain started to fall, cold and heavy, but he didn't care about getting wet. He fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he tried to unlock the door. Once inside, he locked all the doors immediately, checking the rearview mirror repeatedly as he drove away. He kept expecting to see a figure standing in the window of the house, watching him leave, but the windows remained dark and empty. The drive home was a blur of anxiety, his mind replaying the moment he waved at the mirror. He tried to rationalize the fear, telling himself it was just adrenaline and the creepy atmosphere of the location. But deep down, he knew something had changed during that brief interaction. He arrived at his apartment building, feeling safe only when he was behind his own solid steel door. He showered quickly, trying to wash off the feeling of the house, but the coldness seemed to have seeped into his bones. No amount of hot water could warm him up. Back in the safety of his own apartment, Elias tried to resume his normal evening routine. He made a cup of coffee, his hands still trembling slightly as he held the warm mug. The lights in his living room were bright and familiar, chasing away the shadows that had plagued him at the manor. He turned on the television, filling the silence with noise, anything to stop his own thoughts from racing. He sat on his couch, staring at the screen without really seeing the program. Every time the screen went dark for a scene change, he caught his own reflection in the black glass of the TV. He found himself avoiding looking directly at it, turning his head away instinctively. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the house had just gotten into his head. He finished his coffee and decided it was time to sleep, hoping that rest would reset his mind. He walked down the short hallway to his bedroom, trying to ignore the small mirror on the wall. He changed his clothes quickly, keeping the lights on, unwilling to sit in the dark. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the window. But sleep did not come easily. Instead, a growing sense of dread began to pool in his stomach. He needed water, and that meant going to the bathroom. The need for water became urgent, forcing him out of the relative safety of his bed. He walked down the hall to the bathroom, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. The bathroom was small, tiled in white, with a large mirror above the sink. He turned on the tap, letting the cold water run while he splashed some on his face. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the glass above the sink. When he finally looked up to dry his face with a towel, the bathroom light flickered once, buzzing loudly. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the light to stabilize. It hummed back to life, casting a harsh glare on the mirror. Elias leaned over the sink, gripping the edges tightly, and finally forced himself to look at his reflection. He looked exhausted, his eyes dark with lack of sleep. He sighed, leaning closer to inspect a spot on his cheek. The reflection sighed with him, matching his movement perfectly. He relaxed slightly, feeling foolish for his earlier fear. He turned off the tap and reached for the light switch to leave. But as his hand moved toward the switch, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. The reflection's hand was not moving toward the switch. Elias stopped moving, his breath catching in his throat as he stared into the glass. His own hand was reaching for the switch, but the hand in the mirror was still resting on the edge of the sink. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the flickering light, but the image remained static. The reflection was no longer mimicking him. It was waiting. Slowly, Elias lowered his hand back to the sink, and only then did the reflection move its hand to match the position. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, chilling him to the bone. He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped inside his chest. He stared into the eyes of the figure in the glass, searching for some sign of humanity, but the eyes were empty and dark. The figure in the mirror smiled, a slow, cruel expression that Elias was not making. He tried to step back, to run away from the sink, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The reflection raised its hand slowly, not in fear, but in greeting. It was the same wave Elias had given in the abandoned house, but this time, the gesture was returned by something else. The entity in the glass was no longer bound by the rules of physics. It was independent, alive, and hungry. The reflection waved again, more vigorously this time, inviting Elias to come closer. The glass surface began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone, losing its solidity. Elias tried to turn his head away, to break the line of sight, but his neck refused to obey his commands. He was paralyzed by a force that originated from within the mirror itself. The figure in the glass started to lean forward, pressing against the surface from the inside. The gold frame of the mirror in his bathroom began to tarnish rapidly, turning black like the one in the manor. He realized with horror that the two mirrors were connected, bridged by the joke he had made hours ago. The reflection mouthed words that made no sound, but Elias could read the lips clearly. It said, "Thank you for the invitation." The bathroom temperature plummeted, frost forming on the tiles around the sink. Elias felt a pulling sensation, as if gravity had shifted and was dragging him into the wall. He clawed at the counter, his nails scratching against the porcelain, but he was sliding forward. The boundary between his world and the reflection's world was dissolving rapidly. There was no escape from the glass now. With a final, desperate struggle, Elias tried to close his eyes, but they were held open by invisible fingers. The reflection reached out, its hand passing through the glass as if it were smoke. Cold fingers wrapped around Elias's wrist, gripping him with impossible strength. He was pulled forward, his face pressing against the cold surface. The last thing he saw was his own apartment fading away, replaced by the dusty room in the Victorian manor. The reflection stepped out into the bathroom, stretching its limbs as if waking from a long sleep. It looked around the modern apartment with curiosity, touching the towels and the lights. It smiled, wearing Elias's face perfectly, but with eyes that held no soul. The entity walked out of the bathroom, turning off the lights behind it. In the mirror, now dark, Elias pounded on the glass from the other side, screaming silently into the void. He was trapped in the reflection, forever watching the world through the glass. The house had claimed him, not by taking him there, but by bringing the house to him. The wave he offered was the contract he signed, and now he was the one left in the dust. The explorer had become the exhibit,